Johnny Carson stands at his desk. October 1972. The band is between songs. The audience is still settling into their seats, and Carson opens the monologue with a joke about his own divorce. The audience laughs. 12 million people watching from their living rooms laugh with him. What almost none of them know is that the joke landed 3 days after his lawyers finalized what newspapers were already calling one of the most expensive divorce settlements in the history of American entertainment. His wife of 9 years, Joanne, wasn't in the audience. She wasn't watching from home either, according to people who knew her. The most private man on American television had just turned the wreckage of his second marriage into 90 seconds of material for the largest audience he would ever have. That instinct, take the wound, package it, sell it, never let anyone see the actual damage, is the entire story of Johnny Carson's marriage to Joanne. And by the time you understand where that instinct came from, the joke stops being funny. Start with the boy before the myth. Carson was born in Iowa in 1925 and raised in Norfolk, Nebraska, the second of 3 children in a household run by a mother named Ruth. Biographers who spent years reconstructing his early life, most notably in the exhaustive research behind Bill Zamie's posthumously completed biography, describe Ruth Carson as a woman who was almost pathologically withholding of praise. Carson himself, decades later, in interviews given near the end of his career, said plainly that he didn't think he had ever pleased her. Not once. He said it without much drama, the way you'd report a fact about the weather. That's worth sitting with. A man who built an empire on being liked by 20 million strangers every night could not remember a single moment of feeling approved of by his own mother. People who grew up in Norfolk and later spoke to biographers described the Carson household as outwardly ordinary and inwardly cold, the kind of Midwestern reserve that doesn't announce itself as damage until decades later, in a therapist's office or a biographer's transcript. There was no dramatic cruelty to point to, no single incident anyone could name. Just a steady, lifelong withholding, the kind that teaches a child not that he is unloved, but that love is conditional on performance he can never quite complete. That distinction matters enormously for everything that follows, because a child who learns that lesson doesn't grow into an adult who avoids relationships. He grows into an adult who becomes extremely good at earning approval on a stage while remaining fundamentally unconvinced that any of it counts. He found the workaround at 12, a mail-order magic kit. He taught himself card tricks and coin vanishes in his bedroom and started performing at local events as the Great Carsoni. Watch what that hobby actually is. Magic is the art of controlling exactly what an audience is permitted to see. You show them one hand while the other hand does the real work. A boy who couldn't get his mother's genuine attention taught himself, with a deck of cards, how to command a room's attention completely while revealing nothing true about himself at all. That skill made him one of the most successful entertainers in American history. It also, according to nearly everyone who tried to get close to him for the rest of his life, made him almost impossible to actually know. By the time Joanne entered the picture, Carson had already run this pattern once. He married his college sweetheart, Jody Wolcott, in 1949, and they had 3 sons together, Christopher, Richard, and Corey. Before that marriage collapsed in 1963 amid reports, widely covered at the time, of infidelity on Carson's side. He took over The Tonight Show in October 1962. His first marriage ended the following year, and within months of that divorce being finalized, he married Joanne Copeland. Read that sequence again. He didn't take time alone. He didn't pause. The man who had just become the most famous host in America replaced one wife with another almost as fast as the paperwork allowed. If you're looking for the first warning sign in the story of his marriage to Joanne, it isn't anything that happened during the marriage. It's how quickly it started. Joanne was, by the accounts of people who covered the couple at the time, poised, attractive, and entirely unprepared for what she was walking into. She had worked as a flight attendant before meeting Carson, a career that in the early 1960s carried its own glamour, its own discipline, its own performance of composure under pressure. Skills, it turned out, that would serve her more in the marriage than she could have known when she said yes. What she was marrying wasn't really a man. It was a job with no closing hours, attached to a man who had already demonstrated in his first marriage that he could not or would not be fully present for the people who loved him. She married him in 1963, the same year The Tonight Show was becoming appointment viewing for the entire country, and she spent the next 9 years as the wife of a man whose real face almost nobody, including her, was ever allowed to see. Here's what that actually looked like day to day. Carson taped his show late in the afternoon for broadcast that night. which meant his working hours ran backwards from everyone else's. He was, by multiple documented accounts, functionally nocturnal, awake and sharp for the cameras, then withdrawn once they were off. Kenneth Tynan, in his famous 1978 New Yorker profile of Carson, described a man who maintained what Tynan called an almost impenetrable shield around his private self, a performer who could command total intimacy with a studio audience and total distance from the people closest to him in the same 24 hours. That contradiction is the whole marriage. The country believed it knew Johnny Carson because he sat across a desk from them every night and made them feel like a friend was talking directly to them. Joanne was married to the person standing behind that desk, and by every account that surfaced later, that person was someone else entirely. Friends of the couple, quoted anonymously in profiles written years afterward, described dinners at home that felt less like conversation and more like waiting rooms. Carson present in body, already halfway rehearsing a monologue in his head, or simply gone somewhere no one else in the house could follow him. This wasn't framed by the people who knew them as cruelty exactly. It was described more as absence, a kind of permanent low-grade unavailability that no amount of wealth or status could paper over indefinitely. A marriage can survive one partner's job being demanding. What's harder to survive is a partner who has trained himself since childhood to treat total emotional withholding as a survival skill and then brings that skill home every single night. Then there was the drinking. This isn't speculation stitched together from hostile sources decades later. It's something Carson's own longtime lawyer and close friend Henry Bushkin wrote about at length in his 2013 memoir. Bushkin, who worked alongside Carson for 18 years and had a closer view of his private life than almost anyone, described a man who could be warm and generous sober and genuinely frightening when he drank, prone to sudden cutting anger that could turn on the people nearest to him with no warning. Bushkin wasn't writing to destroy Carson's legacy. He was writing as a friend trying to be honest about a complicated man. And even in that friendly account, the pattern is unmistakable. The warmth had a switch. Nobody around him ever knew for certain which version of Johnny Carson was going to walk through the door. According to Bushkin's account, that unpredictability wasn't confined to a single incident or a single bad year. It was a recurring feature of the marriage. One that people close to the couple learned to navigate the way you'd navigate weather, checking the mood before deciding whether a conversation was safe to start. Read enough of these accounts, and a pattern becomes clear that goes beyond any one anecdote. The same control Carson exercised so precisely on camera, timing every pause and every look for maximum effect, seemed to disappear entirely once the cameras were off and a glass was in his hand. The discipline was real. It just wasn't available to the people who needed it most. Layer onto that the reports, consistent across multiple biographers and contemporaries, that Carson had affairs during his marriage to Joanne. I want to be careful here the way any honest account has to be. No court document, no confession, settles the specifics of who or how many. What isn't in dispute is that the rumors were persistent enough and credible enough to people who actually knew the couple that they became part of the public record surrounding the divorce itself. A man who spent his professional life building a reputation as the trustworthy voice America let into its bedroom every night was, in his actual bedroom, apparently someone his wife couldn't fully trust either. Now put a third pressure into that house. Joanne wasn't just marrying Johnny Carson. She was stepping into a stepmother role for 3 young sons from a marriage that had ended in exactly the kind of acrimony that makes blended families hard even under the best conditions. Carson's relationship with his own sons was, by multiple accounts, including his own lawyers, distant for most of their lives. He was present as a name and a paycheck more consistently than he was present as a father. That left Joanne managing children whose own fathers struggled to connect with them, inside a marriage where the man at the center of the household was, by his own design, largely unreachable. She wasn't failing at something normal. She was administering a household that had been built, from the very architecture of Carson's personality, to keep everyone at arm's length. Think about what that actually required of a woman in her 20s and 30s with no public role of her own to retreat into. No foundation, no book deal, no cause with her name on the door. She had none of the institutional armor that later, more publicly documented political wives would build for themselves. What she had was a famous last name, a house full of children who weren't originally hers, and a husband whose most reliable form of intimacy was performed nightly for strangers rather than offered privately to her. That imbalance, everything given to the audience, the remainder, if there was any remainder at all, given to the marriage, is the quiet center of the entire relationship. By the late 1960s, the strain was visible enough that people close to the couple later described a marriage that was functioning mostly for the cameras. The public version was seamless. Johnny and Joanne Carson, photographed at premieres and industry events, the successful host and his elegant wife. The private version, according to the accounts that came out later, was two people living increasingly separate lives inside the same expensive house, held together by habit and by Carson's own aversion to disruption more than by anything either of them would have called love. It ended in 1972. And when it ended in a way that made news well beyond the entertainment pages. The settlement was reported at the time as one of the largest in the history of celebrity divorce to that point. Enough money that newspapers ran the figure as a standalone headline, treating it less as a family matter than as a business transaction between a network star and the woman who had spent 9 years married to him. That's worth pausing on. The dissolution of Joanne's marriage was covered less like a heartbreak and more like a merger falling apart. And within days, the man at the center of it was back behind his desk, working the divorce into his monologue for laughs because that was the only language he had ever fully trusted with an audience, the joke, not the wound. Consider what that timing actually demanded of Joanne. She was living through the public dissolution of 9 years of her life while, every weeknight, an audience of millions watched her ex-husband turn that same dissolution into a punchline delivered with impeccable timing. There was no equivalent stage available to her. No monologue, no studio audience, no laugh track to convert her side of the story into something manageable. The asymmetry of that, one person's pain becoming the other person's material, is not incidental to the marriage. It is close to the entire lesson of what marrying Johnny Carson actually meant. Here is where the story stops being sad and starts being disturbing. Carson didn't take time to process any of it. Weeks, not months, weeks after the divorce from Joanne was finalized, he married for a third time to a woman named Joanna Holland. Say that out loud. He went from a wife named Joanne to a wife named Joanna in the space of a single season. Multiple people who knew him at the time have pointed out how strange that overlap in names was, whether or not it meant anything psychologically. What it demonstrates at minimum is a man who could not tolerate the empty space where a marriage used to be. The moment one structure came down, he needed another one standing in its place immediately, occupied by someone who looked, on paper, remarkably similar to the person who had just left. It's worth asking, as biographers eventually did, what exactly Carson was replacing so urgently. Not companionship in any conventional sense. By every account, he was capable of enormous stretches of solitude, and friends described him as someone who genuinely valued being alone with a book or a chessboard more than most people in his position ever admitted publicly. What he seemed unable to tolerate wasn't loneliness itself. It was the absence of a structure to perform inside of. A wife, like a studio audience, was infrastructure. Without one, there was nothing to be composed for, nothing to manage, nothing to keep at the correct professional distance. The remarriage wasn't about Joanna Holland specifically. It was about rebuilding the apparatus as fast as humanly possible. That third marriage, to Joanna Holland, lasted longer than the marriage to Joanne, 13 years, and it ended in 1985 in a divorce that was, by the standards of the day, even more expensive and even more publicly bitter, with reported settlement figures in the tens of millions of dollars and a court fight ugly enough to make headlines for months. Which means that by the time Carson was 60 years old, he had built and dismantled 3 marriages, fathered 3 sons he struggled to be close to, and spent, by conservative estimates from reporting at the time, tens of millions of dollars on the legal cost of leaving people. The pattern that started with a withholding mother in Nebraska had, by his 60s, become a documented, repeating, expensive machine. Carson married once more in 1987 to Alexis Moss, a marriage that lasted until his death, and that people who knew the couple in his later years described as calmer, quieter, more settled than anything that came before it. Some biographers have framed that fourth marriage as evidence that Carson finally found peace. Maybe he did. But it's worth noticing what made that peace possible. By 1987, he had already spent nearly 40 years and an enormous fortune learning, through 3 prior marriages and 3 prior sets of legal proceedings, exactly how much closeness he could tolerate and exactly how much distance a marriage required to survive him. The fourth marriage wasn't a different man. It was the same man, finally calibrated by decades of expensive trial and error to a distance he could actually sustain. And then the machine reached his own children. In June 1991, Carson's middle son, Richard "Rick" Carson, died in a car accident while photographing wildlife along the California coast. He was 39. People close to Carson at the time, including Bushkin, described a man who was devastated in private and almost entirely unreadable in public. A father who, even in grief, defaulted to the same shielded composure that had defined his entire adult life. He dedicated a photography book of his son's work and gave restrained, careful public statements. What he apparently didn't do, according to those closest to him, was let anyone fully see what the loss actually did to him. The same instinct that had made him unreachable to Joanne in 1965 was still running the show in 1991, at the worst moment of his life, with nobody left to blame it on except the man himself. Colleagues who worked with him in the months after Rick's death described someone who returned to the studio and did the job at the same exacting level he always had, hitting his marks, delivering his monologue, giving no visible indication on camera that anything in his life had changed at all. To an audience that had spent 30 years believing they knew this man because he talked to them every night, that seamlessness should have been the loudest signal of all. The performance never cracked, which meant, by definition, that whatever grief actually looked like inside that house, the audience was never going to be shown any of it. The wall Ruth Carson's withholding had built in a Nebraska bedroom 60 years earlier was still standing, and it held even against the death of his own son. Now here's the detail that ties the entire pattern together, and it has nothing to do with any of his wives directly, which is exactly why it's so revealing. At the peak of his negotiating power in the early 1980s, Carson used his leverage with NBC to secure something almost no television star before him had ever owned: the rights to his own show's masters. Beginning with tapes from a certain point in his run, Johnny Carson personally controlled the copyright to years of The Tonight Show, thousands of hours of the most watched television in American history. And having secured that control, he did something almost nobody expected. He mostly kept it locked away. For decades, vast stretches of Carson's Tonight Show archive were withheld from syndication, rarely licensed, largely unseen by the public that had once tuned in nightly to feel like they knew him. The man who spent 30 years making an entire country believe he was letting them in ended his career by legally guaranteeing that the fullest record of that career would sit in a vault under his control, seen only when and if he decided. Industry executives who tried for years to license those tapes for rerun packages or retrospective specials came away, according to later reporting, with the same answer over and over: not now, not yet, sometimes not at all. There was no obvious commercial logic to leaving that much valuable footage unused for that long. The logic was personal. Ownership meant the choice of exposure stayed entirely his, permanently, with no studio executive and no network, and notably, no ex-wife's lawyer ever able to force a single frame of it into the world without his signature on the release. It is very nearly the same clause, restated in copyright law, that had governed every one of his marriages. Everyone gets exactly what he decides to show them, nothing more. That is the same man who married Joanne in 1963. The instinct is identical. Command the room. Reveal exactly as much as serves the performance. Own the tape. Never hand over the real reel to anyone who might actually look at it too closely. Not a network, not an audience. And judging by 9 years of a marriage that ended in silence dressed up as a punchline, not a wife either. Joanne, for her part, rebuilt a life largely outside the reach of that story, remaining in Los Angeles and staying connected for years afterward to a small circle of people from the literary and entertainment world, including a notable friendship with the writer Truman Capote in his later years. She rarely spoke publicly about the marriage in any detail, and what little she did say tended to be measured, almost diplomatically vague. The same instinct for containment, in its own quieter register, that defined the man she'd been married to. Whether that was self-protection, dignity, or simply exhaustion with a subject she had already spent 9 years living through, the record doesn't fully say. What the record does show is that she never wrote the tell-all. She never gave the interview that filled in the blanks Carson's own silence left behind. In that sense, even after the divorce, even after the joke on national television, the story stayed his to tell or not tell, exactly as it always had. So go back to that October night in 1972. The band, the desk, the joke about the divorce that had just cost him a fortune, and by every account of the marriage that produced it, cost Joanne 9 years of trying to reach a man who had built his entire life around not being reached. The audience laughed because they thought they were watching Johnny Carson be honest with them the way he was every night. Vulnerable, self-deprecating, letting them in on the joke. What they were actually watching was the final trick. The hand you could see, doing exactly what it was supposed to do, while the other hand, the one holding the real story, the real cost, the real 9 years, stayed exactly where it had always been. Out of sight, under his control, the one thing he never actually let anyone touch.